City Council. Mr. Allen, would you please lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Allen.
You're welcome.
If you would like to speak tonight during citizens' comment period, there are sheets provided at the tables in the back of the chambers for you to sign up. And we also continue to provide for remote participation. Mr. Hand, would you remind our listeners how to call in?
Yes, ma'am, I'm glad to do that. Our call-in number is 844-844-9200. When prompted, please enter the access code for our meeting this evening, which is 398145, followed by the pound sign, 398145 pound sign. At that point, you'll hear a prompt that the Q&A session has started, at which time you need to press *6. You'll hear at that point, if you'd like to speak, please press 1 to be added to the queue. Press 1, obviously. And then you'll begin to hear the audio feed from our meeting. And then at some point, at the appropriate time, our moderator will prompt you to share your comments with the council.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hand. Item 3 is adoption of the meeting agenda. Is there a motion to approve the meeting agenda as presented?
Madam Vice Mayor, I would offer a motion to approve with one modification, that is to remove item 6B and defer consideration to a future meeting.
Okay. Is there a second to approve the amended meeting agenda with item 6B tabled for a future meeting?
I'll second that.
Okay. Is there any discussion? No discussion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries 3-0. Item 4 is matters from Vice Mayor. I do not have anything to say tonight other than welcome to our council meeting. It's good to see everyone. Moving on to item 5 is matters from council. Do any members have matters you would like to discuss?
The only thing I've received in the last several days is some complaints about the paving going on. And I understand we've had a few little problems trying to get that organized, but I came through Rosser today when they were paving, and it was moving a lot better. So I hope it continues to do that.
Yeah, I'll offer that to you likewise. But on a more positive note is I look at it and I would encourage folks when they see that flurry of activity through our city, that's where your tax dollars are going. And so it's really something to really be encouraged by and motivated and excited about. Because you know, a lot of folks always say, well, what am I spending my taxes on? And these are the sorts of services, core functions of government that we enjoy as a community. And so to be patient as we work through these improvements that make our community more vibrant moving forward.
Thank you, Mr. Allen and Mr. Short. Moving on to item 6. Item 6 is consideration of items on the consent agenda with item B removed from consideration and postponed for a future meeting. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda as amended?
We'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Mr. Short. Is there any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion carries 3-0. That takes us to item 7, and that is to receive information about a proposed stormwater project in the Hopeman Station neighborhood, and consider adopting a resolution supporting an application for a stormwater local assistance fund grant to provide a portion of project funding. Mr. Shaw.
Madam Vice Mayor, members of council, good evening. I think you're aware that the city holds a national pollution discharge elimination permit, which is managed by the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, to discharge stormwater runoff to surface waters, including the South River, which is a tributary of the Chesapeake Bay. This permit is managed under the city's MS4 program, or Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System program. And the permit has special conditions because of the fact that the South River is a tributary of the Chesapeake Bay. One of the things that we're required to do is to develop programs that reduce nutrient loading, primarily nitrogen and phosphorus, to tributary waters through various types of either programs or physical interventions. And so some of the types of things that we would do would be, to develop educational programs and to encourage through the development practices and regulate development and so forth to reduce nutrient loading. But then also things like street sweeping, that we get credit for nutrient reduction and sediment reduction through street sweeping. One of the primary capital improvements has to do with the way that stormwater detention ponds are constructed, and in some cases reconstructed, in that years ago the regulations were primarily focused upon reducing the quantity of water that flowed through those structures, and more they've been required to meet quality improvements as well. We've had a couple of projects in the city, successful projects, where we took existing stormwater ponds and retrofitted them so that they would reduce nutrient loading to the downstream receiving channels downstream. And you may be aware of the Pelham East pond retrofit, where we essentially go in and create wetlands, or more recently the Mulberry Run pond that's over in Jefferson Park subdivision near Randolph Street. And we are proposing to seek grant funding through the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund, that's a DEQ program, to do another pond that's in the Hopeman Station area. I think you're probably familiar with the location of Hopeman Station subdivision. This is Hopeman Parkway, and this is the entrance road into Hopeman Station, Monroe Street. And then adjacent to Hopeman Parkway and the CSX railroad track, there's an existing stormwater pond that was constructed, 25 years ago or so. And so what would be done would be very similar to what we did at Mulberry Run, where essentially what you're trying to do is slow water as it moves through the pond itself, so that and then to plant, have a planting that creates both habitat and uptake for nutrients that are in the stormwater runoff. And so what's done is really you're channelizing water, in a series of essentially streams. You create a forebay and a back bay for the pond to slow the movement of that water. And then, as I say, there are wetlands plants that are put in place to uptake the nutrients. And then we get credit for the calculated load of nutrient reduction in the pond itself. So, for instance, with the Mulberry Run pond, we calculate that in a year's time, or over the course of several years, you take up hundreds of pounds of phosphorus and similar quantities of nitrogen. So the pond here then would be a more natural area. And much as we completed with Mulberry Run, this is a rendering of what it might look like. It's a great habitat for birds and insects and small mammals, as well as creates a place in the neighborhood for walking trails and that sort of thing. The project that we're proposing is, and I might note that we were so successful at Mulberry Run that we received both an Environmental Protection Agency Innovation Award and then a Chesapeake Bay Foundation Award for habitat development. So the project here would have an estimated cost of $1,050,000. Half of that would be paid through the SLAF grant fund. Half of it would be borne by the city. We're proposing that we would take the funds from the retained earnings and the Stormwater Fund to be able to provide the city's match. Our grant is due the end of this month, a matter of days, July 30th, And we've prepared a resolution for the council's consideration endorsing the grant application. Glad to answer any questions council might have.
Just one question, does it, is a local match required? Is the source of that local match have to be from an apportionment of local tax dollars, or might we supplement our 50% share through other grants? I mean, like there's Big Bay Foundation or otherwise?
We've looked specifically at whether some of the money that flows through ARP would be available, and we think that it would be, but I don't want to confirm that without a little bit more investigation.
Okay.
But our initial read of that program is that we could make our match with those funds.
Yeah, it'd just be great to keep our retained earnings if we possibly if we can, so, okay.
Are there any more questions about the project or the grant? Okay. So is there a motion to adopt the resolution supporting the SLAF grant?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mr. Short. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Is there any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion passes 3-0. Item 8 is to consider adopting a resolution regarding the Opioid Abatement and Settlement Fund Allocation Memorandum of Understanding. Ms. Michelson.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Madam Vice Mayor, members of council, as council is aware, the city of Waynesboro, along with almost 80 other Virginia localities, have for the last almost 2 years been engaged in litigation against various supply chain defendants involved in the manufacture, sale, and distribution of pharmaceutical opioid products. The city's lawsuits seek recovery of the public funds previously expended and to be expended in the future, combating opioid addiction and many of its related negative impacts to the city. Similar lawsuits asserting claims on behalf of the Commonwealth of Virginia have been filed by the Virginia Attorney General's office, and the same type of litigation by other states and the federal government are also occurring. These suits are starting to yield some concrete and potentially beneficial results as far as funding from either settlements or went to trial and have a judgment against these types of defendants. So in Virginia, there's a realistic possibility that a settlement will be achieved in 2021, late 2021, with at least one of these defendants, and similar settlements with the other defendants can be hoped for and expected in 2022 and maybe into 2023. In light of the anticipated recovery of the funds, representatives from the Virginia local government's attorneys, including Waynesboro's attorneys, have been actively negotiating with the Attorney General's office for many months over the allocation, distribution, and use of these settlement funds. Both sides have really needed to work together to produce a constructive and viable agreement, which has come into the form of the attached Memorandum of Understanding. And it's been, like I said, almost a year in the making, and it has significantly progressed in favor of the 80-some localities. Initially, the Commonwealth was very eager to maintain much more control over the funds, and then have programs that localities, could apply for, like grants, rather than giving direct funds to the localities. So the good news in that is that the attorneys have been successful in getting more direct funds to the localities. So there's really two aspects of the MOU. One is the recent legislation passed by the General Assembly in July of 2021, creating what's called the Opioid Abatement Authority. And several statutes in the Virginia Code creates this authority, and it has the responsibility for managing and awarding money from what is called an opioid abatement fund, and which the money will come from settlement of this various litigation efforts in pending currently. It's designed to orchestrate and manage appropriation of opioid recoveries by the various governmental entities in Virginia. And the MOU is like a balance between the competing interests of the Commonwealth and the localities, and yet it's still protective of the city's interests. The statutes creating the authority are designed to bring order and predictability to the distribution. Even though the funds are not yet secured, the goal in mind with the governor wanted to have a system in place and an idea of who's going to get what money and what can you use that money for. Unlike the idea is sort of, it's very similar in sort of global design as the CARES money, but as you may recall, when we got the CARES money, everybody was running around like, what can we use it for, what can't we use it for, and which changed almost on a daily basis. So the thought process is that let's get ahead of that. We know this money will be coming, so let's get ahead of that and create this authority that can set up those guidelines and the allocation and distributions. I still feel that with anything, there will probably be some massaging of and further clarification, if you will, as what does it mean that you can use it for opioid recovery, programs, flesh out really more of what that means. But hopefully, the authority will be able to implement and put into place some initial guidelines before the localities get the money, so we have a better understanding of what we're going to use the funds for. So that's one of the main purposes of the authority. The authority will be governed by 11 board of directors from various differing expertise areas who will ensure that the funds are used to support prevention, treatment, and recovery. The other aspect of the MOU between the Commonwealth, which is in line with the Virginia Code, is how are we going to allocate and distribute these settlement funds. And when I say settlement funds, I don't just mean, within the litigation, if we settle before trial. Settlement funds has been defined as a much broader source of revenue, either from, a settlement before trial, a jury award if we go to trial. And a lot of these manufacturers have filed bankruptcy. You might have heard of some of them. Purdue is one of the biggest ones. They filed bankruptcy. The Malink Prod have filed bankruptcy. And so the bankruptcy courts are administering that whole entire process, and they will be distributing the funds. And the bankruptcy courts get to decide the use, for example, in the Purdue pharmaceutical, the bankruptcy court has already determined that all of the funds from Purdue must have the restriction of it has to go to opioid abatement. It can't be in the general fund. It can't be an unrestricted use. So depending on how these settlement resources, come about, there may be additional restrictions on the money in addition to those restrictions and guidelines supplied by the Opioid Abatement Authority. So the allocation is broken down into two parts. And it's a little bit confusing, but the two big parts are 70% goes to what is called the opioid abatement share, and 30% is distributed to the Commonwealth of Virginia and to all of the localities. So of that 30% to the Commonwealth and all the Virginia localities involved, the Commonwealth gets 15%, and the localities as a whole get 15%. And of the 70, the localities get 15% of the 70%. And the remaining portion of the 70% is broken down to, there's 15% to state agencies, 35% I think is to loans and programs and grants that potentially localities can apply for. And then there's a portion for staffing and administrative funds, because all of, there will obviously need to be hired at the state level and the authority employees to administer this, and they will be paid through the funds and not through separate general fund tax dollars. Waynesboro's share of both of these funds is 0.363%. And the AG's office retained, what's his name? Christopher Rum, apologize if I'm saying his name wrong, at University of Virginia, who is supposed to be the preeminent national expert on public health crises in the opioid addiction epidemic. And Mr. Room, which I wouldn't even know how to explain or understand myself, but he took all kinds of data and statistics relating to opioid abuse, healthcare, policing, DSS, just a number of factors where opioid addictions have, ramifications, and put them all together and created a computerized, factoring, and put it in with Waynesboro and what basically affect or how much percentage of Waynesboro has of this opioid addiction, and that's how he came up with this 0.363%. It's not really based on population at all. For example, I know Winchester is maybe a marginally larger city than Waynesboro, but their percentage is 0.6 something percent. So even though they only have a very small, larger population, they have a much more significant share of the pie, because evidently under this formula, they have a lot of more impacted negatively, economically, financially, socially from opioid use than Waynesboro is. So just to give a council a general idea, I use an example. If the settlement net that we get from one of the defendants is 10 million after all costs for attorney's fees and litigation costs, all the localities will get 3 million for general use, no restrictions on it. So Waynesboro would get 0.363 of 3 million, which is $54,450 for general use. The opioid abatement fund will receive 7 million of that 10 million. And then the localities would get 15% of that, which would be $1,050,000. So Waynesboro's 0.363% of that is $38,115. So from that one settlement, Waynesboro would get approximately $90,000 or so from some of it to be used as Waynesboro sees fit, and then the other number, the smaller number, the 38,000 number, to be used solely for opioid abatement programs, which will be later defined and clarified by the Abatement Authority. So basically this MOU approves those two concepts, that the use, the distribution, and the allocation, and the management and monitoring by the Opioid Abatement Authority, because there are some reporting requirements and, like I said, restrictions on use of the monies. So the attorneys who are representing the localities have been very diligent of working with the Attorney General's office and have really struck what's probably the best deal that the localities can get. And so at this point, we feel that, the share that the localities are going to get is reasonable and fair, given all the circumstances, and so that we all feel that it's very advantageous to enter this MOU, and we'll be asking council to pass the resolution giving Mr. Hamp the authority to enter the MOU and make way for the use of these funds. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
So, just for clarification for our viewing audience, what we've been offered as our share of the potential settlement dollars is a fixed percentage, non-negotiable. We can't go back, and it's based off of opioid addiction and the effects of opioid addiction, not particularly the counter effects and the more significant effects. Again, I'm not asking, I guess, to quote the excerpts of the gentleman's research, but I find it interesting. I think when I first joined council, I'll tell you a little anecdote, our police department had an awesome drug addiction symposium over at the high school, which to this day, it was the most educational thing that I've ever been a part of when it comes to addiction. And then have the ability to listen to a few other presentations about addiction, and that, one, the pharmaceutical effects to it, but when someone becomes addicted, and then either they run out of money or the physician stops prescribing the medication, they turn to illicit drugs, which is a very prevalent and complicated and arguably more impactful effect to the opioid crisis. And so, I mean, it is what it is. I mean, I guess, this greater region of the city of Richmond is receiving over 12%, nearly 13% of the settlement dollars, out of the share of 70 of 30, right? But, and whereas our community receives just 0.1% of that. So, but again, just for the sake of conversation, non-negotiable, it is what it is.
And theoretically, the study of how they arrived at those statistics, again, theoretically, they factored all of those extra, the rippling effects of opioid. It's not just defined to like, okay, who has addiction to opioid and who, perhaps called an ambulance or perhaps calls the police. It's supposed to factor in some of those rippling effects. I think there was some kind of, exponential factor to account for the rippling effects that, like you said, that this society will have because of crime and, things that people, unfortunately with addictions do if they stop getting, valid prescriptions for. But yes, it is what it is in the sense of we feel that we've gotten as much as we can from the state as far as we went from pretty much zero for the localities to now at least a portion that we can use for ourselves. And the funds that the Commonwealth are keeping, there's still opportunities potentially, because I don't know what those opportunities will eventually look like, but there is, designed in this system opportunities for localities to apply for grants and perhaps with either matching funds or, who knows what those will look like. But so there may be, in addition to the direct money, there should be money indirectly that localities can apply for and receive.
It's been helpful, thank you.
Okay, any more questions? Okay, so is there a motion to adopt the resolution regarding the opioid abatement and settlement fund allocation?
I'll make that motion.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Short. Do I have a second?
I'll second it.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Any discussion? Okay, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. And any opposed? No. The motion passes 3-0. Number 9 is communications, correspondence, and calendar. Mr. Ham?
Yes, ma'am. I have 2 items, excuse me, this evening. The first being on a bright note, the Shenandoah Valley Arts Center has informed us that they are confident that they can conduct the annual Fall Foliage Art Show event this year, and that event is scheduled for Saturday, October 9th and October 10th. I want to alert council to the fact that I will be approving the associated street closures for that event, which will begin at 3 p.m. on Friday, October the 8th. Additionally, they'll be serving alcohol on public property. If you've attended the event in recent years, in the vicinity of the Circle on Lumos Plaza will be live music, food trucks, and then alcoholic beverages will be limited to that area under a proper state permit and sold and distributed in accordance with permit and ABC regulations. Additionally, earlier this year, I shared a special event application and schedule associated with the Wayne Theater. They have since come back. Originally, their plan was not to include alcohol. They've since come back and asked permission to include alcohol in their event, and this is the monthly concert series that occurs in this block of Main Street right in front of the theater, and I'm working with him to accomplish that. The code of the city allows that the city manager has the authority to make decisions regarding street closures and the consumption of alcohol on public property. But recognizing that to some extent, it's important that the elected body be aware of those decisions and requests, and also contribute to the culture of recreation and socializing and special events in our community. I share this as an informational purpose, and if there are concerns about either, please alert me to that this evening or privately, and then we'll resume. I'll bring the issue back to you. But I just want to be clear on those two things. Obviously, the art show is a long-standing tradition in our community, and I would assume that we're all excited to have that event return. The second item is that you may have read recently that Western State Hospital has closed to new admissions, and that's due to staffing shortages and the inability to attract and retain qualified staff to properly care for people. That has relevance, obviously, to the overall health of our community, but also direct impact to our police department, which has legal responsibility to provide transportation and care or guardian security to those individuals as they work their way through the Commonwealth's mental health system. Given that the closest destination for individuals suffering from severe mental health illness or mental illness is no longer available, that complicates and requires more responsibility and more resource to afford the required care, custody, guardianship, and transportation. The chief has shared with me the impacts that has on his staffing and the patrol division. Obviously, it drains available resources on the street to provide other public safety demands that our community has for the police department, and also creates staffing complications impacting overtime and the ability to grant scheduled leave to our officers. The chief has a strategy that will rely at this point, at least initially, on appropriated funds, so there's no need for the council to appropriate additional funds, and through repurposing of authorized part-time positions at this time. And so I simply provide this again as an informational piece. If you hear about what's going on, I hear we're hiring additional people in the police department related to mental health. This would be associated with this dilemma. And if you hear that, I called for the police department and they weren't able to come as quickly as I would prefer, it may be, not always will be, but may be related to staffing shortages created by this responsibility that we bear under the code. Again, at this point, I think the chief is confident that the strategy will work in the near term, and we'll hope that the Commonwealth takes measures to address the problem. But absent that, we're developing plans to mitigate that locally.
Thank you, Mike.
Just thought I'd go on the record, I totally enthusiastically support the Wayne securing the appropriate ABC premise permit and having the state monitor their activity and renew that accordingly, but I would enthusiastically get behind that event they had last month was remarkable and could be a tremendous fundraiser for them.
Okay, thank you. That brings us to item 10, that's citizen comment period. I would like to remind speakers to state your name and address for the record. You have 4 minutes to address council. The light system serves as our timer. You may continue to speak while the light is green. Yellow is a reminder that you have 30 seconds remaining, and the red light indicates your time is up. We ask that you address council as a whole, and we are here to listen. Will not respond to your direct questions tonight. However, you may speak to us after the meeting or call or email at your convenience. And Mr. Hamp, do we have anyone signed up to speak?
We do. Mr. Craig Scott.
Good evening, honorable members. I appreciate the time, and I hope you're all well in this beautiful summer evening. We needed the rain, and we got it. It's Craig Scott, 1616 Armistead Road, Did everybody get a printout for this? I hope they did. Thank you. I'm just going to button it up. I know it's casting seed on dry soil since with the weather. I want to raise up a couple of empirical points that I haven't had a chance to cover. There are some benefits. Besides creating a permanent tax-paying business in this venue, there is regulatory and liability relief for the city. So there's an environmental issue that which we were just talking about. A company that is responsible for our water and sewer is now liable for it, not us. And we can monitor them with prudence that we always do anyway. So that's another data point that is a plus. Revenues come in, liabilities go down. That's a good thing. I talked to Mayor Henderson on the phone last week. He was most cordial, and I really appreciate it. I don't know if he addressed it or you were informed. It was a very positive conversation, and we talked. This was the proverbial home run. I struck out. I got it. Continuing with the baseball analogy, I want to try for a few singles to help the city, and I think you're already starting to do that, or are always doing it, but maybe I can add a few ideas. The pool. Our public pool is now being privately run, except for the chemicals. Vendor services such as custodial services for our schools, privatization of something as the mundane of our cemeteries. I know trash collection is a thorn. I'll leave that aside. But there are other small items, the proverbial baseball singles that we can do to implement hopefully better service at a lower cost. Filtration fields also for water abatement, drainage for our beautiful Chesapeake, et cetera, can be done in a optimal manner with a private contractor, and they can be held accountable, and they would be liable, not us. Again, an empirical data point. That's it. I'm always open to it. I know it's on dry ground, as I said, but I really appreciate your time and courtesy, and I hope you will look at some of the bullet points. They have highly rated. You could talk to the Lake Monticello people over Fluvanna. They've been thrilled with and there are hundreds of other vendors. I know there's good and bad and rumors and all that. We all dealt with those kind of things since we were kids. That goes on. Well, I appreciate your time, and thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Do we have anyone else?
No, ma'am,
Nobody
we can-
signed up? Nobody online? Okay, so that leaves us to Mr. Allen's favorite part of the meeting. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
As always, I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. And is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Mr. Short, any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We are adjourned.